Hello and welcome to Adventures Through the Mind, a podcast that explores topics relevant and related to psychedelic culture, medicine, and research, and always with the underlying question of how we can work with and through our psychedelic experiences to become better people, not just for ourselves, but for all those with whom we are nested in relationship, presently and across time, human and non-human alike. I'm your host, as always, James W. Jesso. Today's interview is going to be with James Fadiman and Jordan Gruber, the authors of the new book, Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance, which came out this year, 2025. As you can imagine, based on the title of their book and this podcast episode, we're going to be talking about microdosing today. Throughout the interview, you will learn the practical basics of psychedelic microdosing, such as which substances, dosage, frequency, and duration, when in the larger arc of our lives, and who would best benefit from microdosing. And speaking of benefits, we'll also talk about what the benefits of microdosing appear to be according to Gruber and Fadiman's research, which they describe as A to Z, anorexia to zoster, and everything in between. In the latter part of the interview, you're going to learn about what the benefits of microdosing are for various neurological and mental health conditions such as ADHD, TBI, dementia, and depression, and we also go quite deeply into microdosing for the benefit of well people. In this episode, you will also learn some of the issues facing microdosing right now as both a practice and a premise, issues like placebo, research design, and some of the potential dangers of microdosing. Truly, this book is a wealth of knowledge about microdosing, and in pretty much every question I could possibly have thought to ask about microdosing and more were covered in this book, which was really awesome to see, awesome to read. I think it's incredible offering onto the larger psychedelic microdosing culture and subculture, and in many respects onto modern life itself for those of us struggling with its implications in our day-to-day. I can confidently say that this interview itself barely scratches the surface of what's in the book, but I do genuinely believe that this episode is going to offer you some incredibly wide sort of understanding of microdosing, both practically in the what and the hows, and for what, I suppose, but also in premise, like why it is that microdosing seems to be offering what it's offering when it's at a dose level that doesn't seem to be giving any of the traditional effects we associate with psychedelics. Now, also the reality is that this is a very long interview, as you will likely notice before even hitting play, but worry not, as I always include timestamps for each episode in the description wherever you're checking it out, be that on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, etc. And if you listen on other platforms such as Pocket Cast or Overcast, there are chapters embedded in the audio file. So please feel free to take advantage of those timestamps if the 2+ hours is too much for you and there's a particular section you are wanting to jump straight into. But speaking of jumping, before we jump into the interview, which we're going to do in just a moment, I want to invite you to let me know what you think of the episode or any episode of this show that you listen to. I try to respond to whatever comments I can, and I'm also open to suggestions or constructive criticisms on guests, production, topics, etc. If you're on YouTube, you can leave comments. You can also leave comments on Spotify as well now. And there's also a subreddit for this podcast where you can discuss each episode. You can also reach out to me directly on Blue Sky at jameswjesso.bsky.social or Instagram at @mindpodcast. And this will be my last note before we jump into the interview. This is a small podcast and it's a one-person operation, which is me. So any level of engagement you have here with the show, from reviews on Spotify and iTunes to likes and comments on Instagram or YouTube or any of the platforms that you might be checking out or have been exposed to this show or this episode, all of these engagements, they help. They help because I don't have a huge team or a massive following that can help funnel my content to the front of the algorithmic stage. So I genuinely rely on the excitement of listeners like you. And so I thank you for whatever engagement you choose to offer on this episode or others. And that's it. Here is my interview with James Fadiman and Jordan Gruber on Adventures Through the Mind, episode 197. Enjoy. Okay. Jim Fadiman, Jordan Gruber, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Jim, it's your first time here on the show. And Jordan, it's your second time. Interestingly, Jordan, your second time on the show for your second book written with Jim, who just wasn't able to make it to the first interview. So it's a fun sort of welcome and welcome back.
Thank you.
Today we're going to be talking about your new book, Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance, which I'm holding up a copy here on the screen for people listening, which felt like a very excellent overview to the state of microdosing now, and pretty much almost any question anyone could possibly have about microdosing seems to be covered in this book. As I was reading it, I thought to myself, oh, wow, these are all of my questions answered. Wow, these are questions I never even thought to ask, but I'm so glad I now have the answers to them because I didn't realize how important they were, but then here they are in this book. So on behalf of everyone interested and benefiting from microdosing, thank you in advance for writing this book.
That was a long, intense pleasure.
So, go ahead, Jordan.
I was just going to say, because Jim is the pioneer or developer of modern microdosing, we can say he wrote the book on microdosing, but then we needed to write the book about writing the book, so here we are on that.
Awesome. Well, there's a lot to cover, so we'll jump kind of straight in with what is probably the most obvious question that we have to start with, which is essentially, what is microdosing? And I'll tag onto that, what microdosing is and what microdosing is not.
Sure, after you.
Microdosing is taking microdoses with space between for a variety of interests and conditions that seem to help. They seem to improve human health overall. Microdosing is not, and it can be defined as it has none of the characteristics of high doses. No transcendental breakthroughs, no discovering that God only loves you, no being eaten alive by anacondas, no recognition of your all of your incarnations at once. All of that exciting stuff is what we call megadoses or high doses, and that's what it's good for. Microdosing has none of those effects and very few physical effects of its own. But it does seem to have a radical capacity to improve function.
So what exactly, you said the way that you described it makes it seem as though, what defines a micro dose is more qualitative than quantitative. Can you give us a sense of what dosage is for a microdose?
For people in your audience, and most of them will know this, it's 1/10 to 1/20 approximately of a recreational dose of a classic psychedelic. If we're talking numbers, it's about 7 to 11 micrograms of LSD is where most people find it most effective. 1/10 of a gram to 3/10 of a gram of a mushroom, psilocybin containing mushroom for most people. And we'll probably talk about people who use much, much less and a particular class of people who use much more.
And mushrooms are a little bit trickier because some varieties of mushrooms are 2 or 3 times as strong. So that would change the numbers dramatically on that.
Now, you wrote in your book this sort of like weird way in which sub-perceptual became sub-perceptible. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sub-perceptual, when I was trying to figure out a way to describe this, and the word hallucinogenic is a terrible word and describes nothing about psychedelics, so I didn't like it. And I was trying to figure what's the difference between having the flowers explode into love when you go by and the flowers notice you when you go by. So sub-perceptual was it didn't have the perceptual explosions and differences that high doses have. And it's a terrible word. And if I ever find out who did it, what part of me did it, I will punish them. We now use a different word called sub-threshold, which is it is below the threshold of the widely described high dose effects. And that's a simpler definition. And people understand it. The difference is also that when you're taking a microdose, you go about your regular day. You can indeed, as the labels say, you can operate heavy machinery. You can go to your sales meeting. You can go pick up your children at school. You can cook and so forth. Your day functions normally. That is not true with higher doses.
So one thing is that sub-perceptual indicates that you're not perceiving anything. And indeed, many people are aware that they are on something, and then they usually forget about it and just have their good day. The difference between sub-perceptual and sub-perceptible is just linguistic drift. It's like, how the evolution of hero's dose and what people say about that now. So there is really no difference between sub-perceptible and sub-perceptual. And either way, it wasn't a good word because often people are aware, which brings us right back into the whole thing about can you blind psychedelics, which you won't go to now.
And the answer is you can't.
So you'll find there's like a dedicated sort of dose range that people can experiment and find, but what they're shooting for is this state where you've taken enough that you're getting some benefit. You're noticing something, but what you're noticing isn't I'm kind of high right now.
In fact, it's very nice. If you're kind of high right now, that's by definition an overdose. So you can viscerally find out if you're taking a little too much. And the problem with a little too much is it doesn't have the same beneficial effect.
So there really is a sweet spot. There really is a dosage range. Think of it like electron orbital shell levels. You're here or you're here. If you're in the middle, it's not good. And so the thing about microdosing that's so confounding for a lot of people is to realize that less is enough. That's all, and that's all you need. And people who have previously taken psychedelics in substantial amounts, they have a harder time dialing in and just sticking because they want to have the beginning of that threshold experience happening. And that's exactly what they need to stay under.
Like as in, I'm not noticing anything isn't a problem. That's not reason necessarily to increase your dose is what you're saying.
What people notice is they feel better. That's the classic notice. If they begin to have that feeling of, I'm kind of taking off, this is really cool, that simply says you've overdosed. So it's built in. And what we find is people who overdose tend to be psychonauts with lots of experience. People with less experience kind of read the directions on the side of the bottle and do what it says.
And it's really important that Jim has said a couple of times about you're in that place where you have no qualms at all about having your regular day, regardless of what's going to come up. You're not in a place where you're going to start doing the sorts of things we might think that can go wrong on psychedelic trips. There's absolutely none of that, and no one will even know that you're on anything. And for the most part, it's not what you're conscious of. I'm on a microdose right now. So Ayelet Waldman's book, A Really Good Day, has a great way of going through that and then saying, and then at the end of the day, I had a really good day, and it turns out I was microdosing, but I wasn't aware of it and thinking of it, although maybe if you really tuned into it, you might be able to feel it.
It's interesting. I'm being reminded of a past experiment in microdosing LSD where I thought I was in that zone and everything was good until I went to the store and ran into someone I knew. And I realized that throughout the whole conversation, I was just trying to hold on because I felt like if at any given moment it was going to break through what was happening and reality was just going to like melt away and all the normal expectations and assumptions about how we move through the world would just be like fallen and it would be chaos. And I'm just trying to go to the grocery store and say hi to a friend. And I'm like, in the back of my mind, I was that meme and I was like, this is not a microdose.
You don't want to have a theophany or an inbreaking of the divine in real time when you're in the grocery store.
Not by accident, anyways. So in your book, you do a little bit of reference to Amanita muscaria, which is for listeners, is a mushroom that is often called a psychedelic mushroom, although, arguably it doesn't qualify as a true psychedelic, and it's very different than psilocybin. Other than some references to Amanita muscaria, you focused entirely on LSD and psilocybin, excluding things like DMT, ibogaine, cannabis, etc. Can you explain why you made that decision, why you excluded these, and why you included those?
Well, we didn't actually design the book and then tell 10,000 people over 10 years to write us letters. It was really the other way around. We were limited by what we actually knew. Now, I know that doesn't sound very brave and certainly doesn't sound like a lot of science, but we were dealing with people's actual lived experiences, and 95 to 98% of them were LSD or psilocybin. So we mention other substances because, like you people ask, but we try not to pretend that we know more than we actually do.
There is an important distinction here, though. So as the authors of this book, we have to draw some lines in the sand, and one of them is, generally speaking, in our view, from what we've heard and what we know, which substances really are appropriate and which really you can't really microdose them. So we do call some of those out. And then on the other hand, there's things like ibogaine that we're aware of, that we know people are working on, and we may have more about that later. But, something like cannabis, we argue, you have a completely different neuroplasticity profile than microdosing, and almost nobody takes one hit and then 3 days later comes back. And so it's just not used anything like microdosing, and the neuroplasticity is different, and it's not really a microdosing thing. And we had a thing with the DMT people, because as you know, DMT vape pens, you're getting it so they can tone it really, really way down. But they've changed their language and are now calling it low dose relational DMT. So they're aware that if you take any DMT whatsoever into your body, part of you really is high. It's just that strong, and that's what happens. So it's not really a good one. And MDMA is not a good one for various reasons. Ketamine is not a good one. So, once again, we come back to the classic psychedelics, but we are aware that people have microdosed with Wachuma or with the Banisteriopsis caapi vine, just the vine part and not the illegal DMT part. And we, are aware of Amanita, and Jim wrote the foreword for Baba Mash's book. But as Jim said, almost everything we've heard of and we've experienced is with these two substances at this point.
Mm. Now, this actually goes into a question I wish I had asked just a minute ago, which I think is an important sort of context for the conversation, is that what is featured in your book is you gathering together, narrativizing, and exploring the data you received voluntarily from, you said, thousands of people over years and years who chose to submit their reports of what they were microdosing, how much, when, what they got out of it. Is there anything more that you want to speak to the sort of the data set that you were writing about in this book?
Well, that was the basic data set. And there's a technical term which I love. It's called real world evidence. And it's distinguished from clinically kind of structured, very contrived experimental situations, which have a whole other set of issues that they're dealing with. And what we know is if one, say, is a pharmaceutical company and they start by inventing a molecule, the only way they actually know they have something of value is not from mice and not from monkeys and not from their own clinical studies. But when a physician says, oh, you have such and such, I think this might help you. Give me a call in a couple of weeks and let me know. That's when you know you have something that is effective or not effective. And because we're starting with plants and mush and fungi that grow all over the earth, and a few thousand years of backstory, we're really coming at it the other way, which is, how does it work in the real world first? And what's happened now is, and the book has a lot of research in it, almost all of it written while we were writing the book. So because there's so much interest, researchers are now coming in and, for the most part, validating, not surprisingly, what everybody else already knows.
We also borrow a little bit from Reddit and the people in our microdosing group with almost 300,000 members. There were some stories in there, and a couple of times specific research was done, like what about bipolar people? How does it work with them? And Jim was able to use Reddit to kind of come to an understanding of what we should say about that. But yeah, it's basically the real world evidence and the Reddit and every study that we could find.
So with continuing to focus from here on in, when I say microdosing, unless I'm asking for some sort of, specifically other than that, I will be talking generally about psilocybin and or LSD, or I'll specifically ask you about LSD or psilocybin, or maybe a little bit later we're going to ask or explore some of those ones that you didn't talk about explicitly in the book. So unlike a macro dose, or we'll say like a fully beyond the threshold, beyond the veil dose of psychedelics, wherein you usually, lots of people use psychedelics differently, but a sort of general sort of safety guideline is, well, you don't take anything in particular for some period of time beforehand. You have your main experience, and then you don't repeat that necessarily for some time afterwards. The sort of the arc of the benefit of it is the singular experience or the one experience. Where with microdosing, you're referring to something that you're doing somewhat repeatedly with spaces in between, and the benefit comes out sometime later, maybe in the acute day, but the real benefits don't kind of come through until you've been doing them for a little while. What does the sort of dosing protocol look like for microdosing? What days of the week? How many days in between? Does that differ between LSD or psilocybin? Are there different variations of it? What are the known microdosing protocols?
Okay, we're going to be obviously brief because the book has it in detail for the obvious reasons that people should understand what they're doing with their own bodies.
Of course.
Microdosing protocols all include days off. And in the larger scope, when one is microdosing, say, for a month or 6 weeks, every protocol includes weeks off. Now, again, if we're going to stop thinking of pharmaceuticals and we're thinking in other ways. The reason that very early on in my explorations, giving it to very experienced psychonauts, and I'd say, well, what happened? They say, well, it felt good. Usually you'd get a little more than that, but that was enough. And then the second day, they would say, hey, I still feel good. Okay. Now, that's called the second day effect. In high doses, it's called the afterglow, and it lasts 4 to 6 weeks with a high dose. So what we were immediately aware of is taking it every day was wasting it and not necessary. And so the protocols that exist, the one that's most used is called the Fadiman Protocol, and it's 1 day on and 2 days off, 1 day on, 2 days off, and for a number of weeks, depending on what you're taking it for. There's another very popular protocol developed by Paul Stamets, which is called the Stamets Protocol, and that's taking it for 4 days on and 3 days off. There's another protocol, which is the easiest one to remember, which is every other day. And then there's people who say, well, I don't need any protocols. I just do it with intuition. I'm not convinced that intuition is as good as noticing what you're doing, but those are the major groups. And those are equally true for psilocybin or LSD. There is something called tolerance. And you were mentioning it kind of indirectly by the problem with high dosing very often is it doesn't work. That if you take a high dose on Monday and God speaks to you and all your traumas are resolved, you say, wow, I want to go back to that. So Wednesday you do it again, and you have maybe a quarter of the same powerful effect. And then you say, well, I just need more. So on Thursday you take double what you took in the first place, and you get no effect at all. So it has a whole different kind of pharmacology, and And the mind, in some sense, says, if you've taken a high dose, we're turning off the receptors because you have to integrate in some way, even physiologically, what you've done. It isn't that you have, it isn't like marijuana, which accumulates in the body. It doesn't at all. So the reason that microdosing is done infrequently is that seems to be enough.
So I have two analogies for you. One was given to me by someone on Clubhouse. They said, imagine taking 100 micrograms once in a month or dividing that into 10 slots of 10. Imagine the same amount of information comes into your system either way. Under which circumstances are you likely to be able to use more of it and remember more of it and really be aware of it and take good use? And the answer, obviously, is by dividing it up. You're just going to forget a good deal on the big dose. The other analogy is a potter's wheel that you kind of kick with your foot and you get it going for a while, but then you don't have to do that. It spins for a while and then you come back to it. So given what we think is happening with microdosing in terms of neuroplasticity and anti-inflammatory effects and bringing people back to equilibrium, when you take just a microdose and then you take it again in a few days, you begin to tune into how to use it and you begin to get some momentum on neurological and physiological levels. I personally think that the Fadiman Protocol is a lot more conservative and therefore better for beginners than Stamets. On the Stamets Protocol, you have 19 doses in a 31-day month. On the Fadiman Protocol, it's 11 doses. And what we found out is that a lot of times the second day really is the best. And we even have research that we talk about in the book that people definitely sleep best on the second day. And it's an unusual large spike in high quality sleep. So I really like the idea of people slowing down and giving themselves time to make use of their neuroplasticity and feeling better and maybe being in a different self and a different part of who they are. And, again, less is enough. We're not in a rush here with microdosing.
And the other piece, which is more unusual, is why you're taking a couple of weeks off. This came up, I certainly had nothing to do with this. This came up independently from people around the world that seemed like a good idea. Again, we're looking at real world evidence. And what people basically found is if they were taking it for a specific condition, often they said, oh, I no longer have this condition. I'm no longer microdosing. Also, when they return, if they return to microdosing for a different condition or even the same one returning, they were better able to dose themselves correctly. Remember, this is something where you, the individual, have to come up with what works best for you, not what an external source says is right. It's pretty much the way you eat food.
I'm gonna pause. I'm hearing a beeping.
Jim's going to do something. I don't know. He did something.
I just thought I turned everything off.
No,
Delay everything. Okay.
It's amazing how the tiny little beep cuts right through the microphone and becomes the big object in the foreground.
Yeah, my middle ear muscles relaxed or tightened up, and I could no longer hear the meaning in the being conveyed through certain frequency patterns.
I'm with you on that.
Can you, sorry, Jim, can you go back and just repeat what you were saying about, people just kind of realize like, oh, I the thing that I was microdosing for seems resolved. And so I stopped microdosing. Can you finish your sort of last part of that thought there?
Well, let's give it a real example which we have literally hundreds of examples of depression. And the people who microdose are what are called treatment-resistant depression, which is if other things have worked for you, you don't show up. Mm-hmm. But people who've had SSRIs for 5, 10, 15 years with no effect or no benefits show up. And what they say is, oh, after I have microdosed for a certain amount of time, I'm not depressed. Meaning they're not less depressed. Their report is, I'm not depressed. It feels the way I did before I was depressed. So we consider that pretty exciting. So they also then take a few weeks off. And they break into two groups. Some people say, I'm done. It's kind of when you had a cut on your hand, it heals. You don't keep re-cutting it and re-healing it. But other things, say arthritis, may be long-term. So at the end of a couple of weeks off, where your body has taken on as much healing as it could from the the help of the microdose. Some people say some of my symptoms are returning. I will do another round of microdosing. Other people say I'm done. So again, this is very hard on conventional science, but it's very easy about talking about real people.
Now you made you dropped a little breadcrumb there with respect to using microdosing for arthritis, and I won't get you to talk about it, but it is in your book. Kind of like leave a little something exciting for people to talk or to read into it later.
Actually, arthritis isn't in the book, but pain is.
Pain.
So
that's right. Pain is in the book. Yeah.
There's a huge section on pain.
Yeah, actually, the little side note is the episode that I'm in post-production to release on the Friday we're recording. This is going to come out sometime later. Friday from the date of right now recording. The next episode coming out is explicitly about psychedelics for chronic pain, but not microdosing explicitly. So let's just leave that for a second. What's that?
Not yet.
Not yet. So is once enough? It sounds to me like the benefits of microdosing, apart from, and I'll ask you a little bit about this later, but just having a good day. I mean, it's great to have a good day, but the benefits of microdosing that you're speaking about, they're coming out not because someone microdosed on Monday and so their life is better. It's because they microdose for a period of time, and it's consistently over a period of time. Is that correct?
Well, let me give you an image. You've been told that if you went to the gym and you did such and such exercises, that such and such muscle groups would improve. So you take a day off and you go to the gym from the time it opens till the time it closes. That's it. You've done 8 different rounds of all these exercises and you're done. And you tell people now you're going to have, and everyone looks at you like you don't quite understand the way the body works. It actually takes a while for tissues and systems and the brain to recalibrate at a higher level of effectiveness. So microdosing seems to keep nudging you the way going to the gym nudges you in the direction that you, first of all, the direction you intend, and then the general direction of improved health.
So
answer that?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. Definitely makes sense. This is a question that's kind of like speaking of microdosing, this is the gym. This is an accessory question at the end in the midst of all our compound lifts here. How consistent does it need to be? So I, put a sort of a nudge out to my patrons on Patreon who have supported the show. Is there any questions you have specifically for you two about microdosing? And one of the questions that came through was about consistency. Like, how consistent do these microdoses need to be? The example that was given was being a shift worker and having 12-hour night shifts for a period of time, and then a time in reverse, and then it's shifting over to days, and wondering, like, it seems like it would be impossible for them to have a consistent, every 4th day at 9 a.m. I microdose, so on and so forth. Does that matter? Can the times change? Like, what does consistency need to look like in order to get these sort of like the benefits that microdosing might offer over this longer period of time that people are exploring it?
Well, remember, if you're taking it every other day, that's a 48-hour period, 48 hours of possible use. We don't really have information on shift work. It's a good question because we know shift work is terrible for most parts of your body. So our suggestion would be is to take it several hours into whenever your day starts, or your actual functioning day, whether that's day or night, so that you are taking it at the same time in your kind of wake sleep period, which shifts. But what we found is if something is in the body over a period of days, it's not a major issue whether it's 10 o'clock or 11:30. So it's a good question, and the answer is make it part of your cycle, just as you're making sleep and waking part of your cycle.
Yeah, so I think the answer is consistency is great if you can have it, but it's not so important that it should override what you need to do to make it actually work in the life that you actually have. So people are going to need to figure that out, and whether or not it's going to affect their sleep and all sorts of different factors for them personally.
So it's not necessarily a loss that they're shifting it by a few hours every few days.
So we're going to get back to a little. Pharmaceuticals tend to be symptom specific. They suppress a symptom. And as long as they're in your body, the symptom is suppressed. And as it leaves your body, the symptom says, terrific, I can recover. And then you take it again and keep it suppressed. And as you know, there are medications which you're supposed to take for the rest of your life. You're never supposed to get better.
Sure, sometimes multiple times a day.
Right, because they only last a few hours. Breakfast is of a different sort. Breakfast is not about when you have it, but that you have it. And again, as Jordan is saying, if you have it at the same time every day, it's easier on the body, as the body's designed for a 24-hour regularity. But if you can't, much better that you improve the body as much as you can, rather than worry about a couple of hours here and there.
And another analogy might be along these lines. If you go to the gym, you don't have to have had protein right before you go or right after you go. If you've had sufficient protein in the 24 hours before or after you've gone, your body's going to figure it out and find enough protein to rebuild the muscles that were torn down. So it's not like you have to have it, the microdose, at any specific time. Although we do have at least one protocol that's a kind of a nighttime protocol for people with ADHD using psilocybin. And they're taking it before they go to bed and basically having most of the experience while they're asleep, and then waking up and having a lot of clarity and a lot of focus.
So really there are, again, that's why you have to write a whole book with details, but there are things when people have night issues, microdosing helps their night systems regulate better. When they have day issues or normal issues, they take it in the daytime. Now, for years, I was amazed because people have more energy. I thought, how could you take it at night? Wouldn't that keep you up? And then the people in the Microdosing Institute in Holland, who've been doing this for years, said, well, people that have night issues take it at night and they say they sleep better and wake up better. And all of a sudden, I realized that it wasn't an energizer. It was what was appropriate for the body at the thing that the body was doing. If the body needed better sleep, microdoses helped sleep. If you needed better waking, it helped with waking. So that all of a sudden, then all of it made sense.
I asking you about this ADHD and sleep protocol is something that I'm going to ask you about later, because I'm very interested in your reference of that into the book. This is another question from my patrons, and it kind of is another timing thing, but totally different. I assume that not everybody who takes larger doses is going to microdose, and not everybody who microdoses is going to take larger doses. But there's a huge overlap in that Venn diagram of people that do both. Based on the data that you've gathered, this real world data, and possibly what you know about sort of our understandings on the sort of molecular pharmacological side of psychedelics, is there an optimal or even like a baseline practice for how to integrate larger doses in the midst of a microdosing protocol? Like a number of days before or after? Yeah.
Well, again, remember the second day effect and the afterglow. So it seems sensible to not have any tolerance issues, to not microdose for a few days or a week before taking a high dose. It makes sense not to microdose after a high dose because you're in a altered physiological and mental state for weeks. And therefore, a microdose will have much less effect. That's one logic. The other logic is that after a high dose, part of integration might be to keep a microdose going. And I remember dealing with a different substance, and this was a shaman, and he said, well, you're taking it with me over this weekend, but it would be very nice for you to take a small amount of the plant every few days to keep in touch with the plant spirit. So that's a different level of kind of explanation and use. And what we found is that given that flexibility, people should check first their own bodies and not overdo it. Again, when Jordan says less is enough, that's actually very hard for many people to get. If there it is, it's dessert and it's cheesecake, and someone says less is enough, and you don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
But that's what they're saying is if overdoing things is called overdoing. It isn't called more is better. More is rarely better, and we know with psychedelics in particular. So the question is very straightforward, is if you're going to do something like a high dose, you want microdose space on both sides.
Is there anything we need to do? Like I'm wanting to start with these really big general questions of microdosing and then start to, funnel into more specifics. And this is kind of the last really general question about the practice of microdosing. Is there anything we need to do while microdosing to get the most of it? And, coupled to that, is there anything that we should avoid doing to get the most out of our microdosing practices?
Yeah, I'll take this. Well, there are things you should avoid doing. You might not want to microdose, for example, on a day when you're going to be doing a lot of international travel, or if you have something particularly physically or emotionally stressful coming up. So you want to be, sensible on that. As to what you should do, there's two really widely divergent school of thoughts. One is that microdoses will work if you take them and you don't have to have an intention, you don't have to do journaling, you don't have to focus on integration later, you don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it. You're just going to start feeling better, let's say. You might be less depressed, or you're more focused and less ADHD. The other view, often held by coaches and people in the industry, is that if you focus on what you want and you set an intention and you then do some journaling and then you do the integration and you're talking with somebody you trust and work things through with, you're going to have a better experience. My take on that is that it depends on the kind of person you are. If you're somebody who already works with coaches and does journaling and likes that kind of stuff, then by all means, go for it. But if you're somebody who always is kind of turned off and it's too new agey and you don't really need that, you can just sort of understand that microdosing is a little bit like a magic vitamin pill, and it's probably going to make you better without you needing to understand anything about neuroplasticity or anything else. And all you have to do is really, take it.
Psychotherapists who used to say, I can't say anything because I'll lose my license, are now basically saying, my patients who are microdosing do better than they did before their microdosing, and I can pick through my patient list. And the reason my microdosing patients do better is they work faster. They go through things more easily. They can handle things that would have triggered them earlier in their therapy. So it seems to improve your capacity to function, including looking at your pathology.
And one other thing I would suggest that people do is at least familiarize themselves with the idea of parts work or working with sub-personalities. A lot of people are familiar with IFS, but this is a book that Jim and I wrote that came out in 2020. Your Symphony of Selves is a lot broader and a lot simpler and shows a whole bunch of different ways. The hard thing is recognizing you're in these different sub-personalities. And when you're microdosing, you're very often able to see which self you're in. So you can steer yourself. We like to say that mental health is being in the right mind at the right time. If you know you have these different parts of who you are, you may see them and you may be able to work with them more simply. So I like having a more accurate model of psychology on board when I'm going to be doing something like this.
Mm-hmm. And your Symphony of Selves was an excellent book. I really enjoyed it. That's why you're Jordan. You were on the show previously to talk about it. I'll leave a link somewhere for people listening to this. It'll be in a description or a pop-up somewhere. And yeah, I would imagine, like, personally, I would say that it is helpful to have a better understanding of how your mind works, period. And then also it's something about microdosing, psychedelics generally, but especially microdosing, almost like creates just like a little bit of like extra capacity or extra awareness. It sort of like turns up, maybe not the gain, but it like raises something that allows a greater perceptibility of these things transpiring in our mind.
So one of the things we hear a lot about is the default mode network is somehow tuned down by psychedelics generally. Or the other way of looking at it is that there's more entropy in the system in the brain. So having a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more plasticity, you can kind of move over to a different part of who you are. For example, if you're somebody who's having terrible pain, and then you move into the part of you that has pain but isn't defined by that pain, that's a very subtle shift. But if you recognize that you can make that move and you do have that part, then you can get back to mostly enjoying your life, even though you also have this pain. So there's something about the flexibility that really lets selves work have a lot of power here.
Now, with your mention of flexibility, so cognitive flexibility in this respect, but also neuroplasticity that you spoke to earlier, which is associated, I want to move into discussion of the benefits. And in your, and I'm going to ask about a few conditions peppered throughout, but I want to still kind of keep this pretty general and broad for now. You in your book, you present, you outline 4 things that you say like microdosing seems to offer people. And then based in these 4 things, you characterize, quote, that microdosing, quote, makes it potentially helpful for any physical or mental condition, end quote. What are these 4 things that it appears microdosing does that can seemingly potentially be helpful for any physical or mental condition?
Well, before we describe what those are, let's go back a step to Dr. David Nutt, formerly the drug czar of England. And when he saw a list of 15 or 20 things that microdosing helps with, he was incredulous. And it's like, it's hard to believe that. So that got Jim thinking that there are other things that are good for everything.
So what he was saying is, I'm suspicious when someone says such and such is good for all kinds of things.
And fair enough, yeah.
And I think that's a very healthy way to be if you're thinking in a system in which each condition is somehow separate. And so pharmacology loves that, because the narrower you get, the basically you control the kind of market for that one symptom. And a way of saying it is, well, nothing's good for everybody. And everybody goes, yeah, that's true. Nothing's good for everybody. And then I say, well, how about sleep? Is that good for everybody? Yeah. Is that good for everything? Well, yeah. How about exercise? Well, yeah, that's good for kind of practically everybody, for practically everything.
Yeah, hydrating. Yeah.
Right. How about improving your diet? Well, that's kind of good for everybody. So you notice we're entering a different category. How about better relationships? Is that good? For things like arthritis or psychopathology, yes, relationships help. Okay, so there's another category of things that tend to work across, not across systems, but inside the same container, which is, remember, the body-mind is an artificial distinction made by people who wanted to have their own departments in the university. So when we then look at why is microdosing beneficial for pain and depression and for postpartum upset and for coding, it's all right. It's okay, because what you're saying is if I rev up the whole system so it runs better, it's no surprise that the individual parts run better, especially the ones that need it. So that's a different way of thinking. And we will say that Professor Nutt gave us a nice endorsement for the book. So he's overcome some of his skepticism.
So once you're at the place where you're going, well, microdosing seems to help almost everything from the physical and mental problems we discuss in the book to a wide swath of performance possibilities in arts and sports. Then we get to looking at, well, what do we know about microdosing? What are we pretty certain about? And sometimes we're at the point where we know things about high doses for sure. And with microdoses, the research shows similar signatures, but a lower amplitude. So that's some of what we're going on. And some things we have more research and we know more about, and some things we're only getting glimmers of. This is one of the reasons that microdoses help. So one of them is certainly neuroplasticity, and especially the work of Connor Murray and neural benefits and neural complexity. We know that microdosing, just as macrodosing does, either tunes down the default mode network, or there's more entropy, or there's more plasticity. We know that something is really going on physically in the brain for certain. We also know that the classic psychedelics, at least, are strong anti-inflammatories, and that inflammation is affects lots of neuropsychiatric diseases, and everybody feels better when there's less inflammation. So we sort of have that also. Saying that people return to equilibrium, or there's, the body wants to heal itself. It's homeostasis. It wants to bring it back into its natural state of optimal functioning. That seems to be happening as well. And then the fourth one that we called out that you remind me of is that it seems to enhance the placebo process, as we'll call it, which is a much longer story and more involved, but it does seem helpful. If people, it makes people more able to believe in their ability to heal, and then they can actually heal better or perform better. And there may be even a fifth one coming down the line. It may be that microdosing supports mitochondrial function, but we don't have enough research. And in some cases, like neuroplasticity, a fair bit, and the book goes into some detail. With respect for inflammation, it's behind where we are in the research on neuroplasticity, but it's definitely coming along, and it's an exciting topic. And another one which I know you're going to bring up is the whole gut biome access, and does microdosing play a role there? And we think it does also. So it seems like there's all these little disparate factors, and microdosing, we know, actually plays a role in all of those.
So we've got increasing neuroplasticity, decreasing inflammation, neural inflammation specifically, I assume, bringing us back to equilibrium, which once we're in equilibrium, our body can start doing the thing it wants to do, which is to heal and rest and digest. And then what was I'm going to go back to placebo at the end here. What was the fifth thing that you said?
Just mitochondria.
Mitochondria. Okay.
There's some beginning evidence that microdosing might directly enhance mitochondrial function,
which
is like cellular energy.
Yeah. Cells,
right?
Yeah.
Little power factories in each cell.
Yeah, it's like we all remember high school biology. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Okay. So I was going to ask about this a little bit later, but I think this is a good place to address it, which is you're talking about accelerating the placebo process. Now, even people whose job it is to stay up to date with all the research on psychedelics, there's no way they can stay up to date on all the research on psychedelics. It's just exploding. Some amount of that is being funneled into different scales and different communities of the general public, and in the midst of that, some of it is being well represented, and some of it is being poorly represented. Some of it is not yet updated. Okay, one of the things that seems to be quite common right now is a perception based on probably early research and various claims being made by different researchers based on their specific data sets, right, that microdosing is all just placebo.
Right.
You address this in the book, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on it now. Is it just placebo?
Well, let's go back a step. Placebo, which is almost a negative word in the science world because it confounds their experiment, is the natural healing capacity of the human body, of the body. And it is accelerated by all kinds of things. If you're given a nothing pill by someone dressed as I am, you'll have a certain amount of positive reaction because I've said it's positive. If I change into a medical costume and give you the exact same words and the exact same pill, it'll have a much stronger effect. Okay, because the natural healing system of the body has now been convinced that because you're wearing something medical, probably you know more, and therefore so forth and so on. Okay, advertisers understand this perfectly. which is you obviously use everything you can, especially when you're into healing. If there are studies which can differentiate, so is there something you can cut the placebo out of? Well, here's a very simple one done again by Connor Murray, which is you give a sufficiently low dose, and this isn't easy, of microdosing so that people actually don't guess. And then you are measuring brainwaves. Now, it turns out when you ask people to, use more strength or smile more or digest better, placebo may help. Nobody's figured out how to jiggle your brainwaves. And so you're simply measuring an actual physiological shift caused by the microdose. And the people who don't get a microdose, their brainwaves don't change. And the people who do have a microdose, they show improved complexity. They show improved functioning. Now, what's wonderful about the experiment is if you keep raising the dose, that improved functioning goes away. So we're talking literally the microdose space. There's no placebo in it. So we have something that is independent of opinion. Okay? And that is the effect. Now, do you want to have in the science world, you want as little placebo as possible because you're measuring stuff. In the real world, you want to have the natural healing response maximized if possible, because that's why someone is there. When I say exercise is good for everybody, it's not good for everybody. It's not good for every condition. But it, in general, is a good idea to think it is, because the benefits are there, and you can, figure out the small areas where it's not. So we're very aware that when someone says it's only placebo, one is they don't know what placebo means, and two is the kind of changes we're seeing. People who've been depressed for 20 years, they've taken 15 different drugs. None of them seem to help. But then someone says, but you took a microdose, which had no physiological effects you could feel except better. That must have been just your mind, because you're a placebo. Clearly the placebo worked and all these others didn't. Doesn't make sense. Okay.
Also, another helpful thing that's often brought up is the analogy to homeopathy. I had a medical doctor come up to me a month ago and she said, look, microdosing is just the homeopathy of psychedelics. And I'm not bashing homeopathy. I actually think homeopathy works in many situations, and animals in India, it's a big deal, and I've had experiences of it. But when you get to the higher doses of homeopathy, you have less statistically than one of the original molecules of the substance left. When you're microdosing, each microgram of LSD has 1.54 quadrillion, that's 16 zeros, molecules. So the average microdose has about 15 quadrillion molecules. Your body has 30 or 40 trillion cells. It's not hard to imagine that there's plenty going on in a microdose to really have this impact. So it's not like nothing's actually happening. And again, also we have brain waves, we have blood flow, we have BDNF markers, all these different things where they've compared large doses to microdoses, and the microdoses have the same signature. It looks the same, but it's just a much reduced amplitude. So the idea that it's just placebo, we have, I think we quote Connor in the book. In Clubhouse at one point, he said, yeah, we don't have to talk about whether it's just a placebo anymore. We know that it's not. So that's pretty much where we are.
So, I'm going to try to shorten this into a tweet, or a Blue Sky post. It's that psychedelic microdosing can support the placebo process, but it is not a placebo.
Right. Well, let me give you a kind of example where if you're measuring something, that's where you're putting all that placebo energy. That's where you wear the doctor costume and so forth. If other things occur that you weren't interested and don't measure, that's really much more interesting. What we found, we were asking people to, they would write us and say, how do I do this? And we would write back and say, here's the doses and so forth. And we'd like you to take a little daily mood test to take you about a minute. How are you feeling? Happy, sad, depressed, anxious, etc. And at the end of 30 days, Send us a note of any changes you've noticed that we didn't ask about. And so people would do this. And then at the end of 30 days, they would write us a note and they'd say, hadn't noticed, but now that I'm looking back over the month, I was taking it because I'm a B student and I wanted to get better grades, and I am getting better grades. Thank you very much. But I also noticed that my sleep has improved. And I noticed that I've gone back to meditation, which I dropped years ago. And my diet has changed for the better. Now, those are all things that nobody was asking for. So those suggest to us real effects. And again, this is not like a one or two people. This became very common because obviously, let's go back. If what microdosing does is improve the body's functioning, your body, you may want to get better grades. Your body wants better sleep. It wants better exercise. It wants better nutrition. And every part of the body seems to get evoked. So that's among the kinds of things we're looking at, which is if things happen that benefit you that you weren't interested in, there are more interest.
So I'm going to move along here. Because this is good. There's more I want to tease in to the question around placebo and studies and data sets, but I really want to save that for later. So I'm going to move into talking a little bit more about the benefits generally here. And, you've talked about pain, depression, there's a whole swath of things in the books that other conditions that people were,
anorexia to zoster.
What's
A
that?
to Z. Anorexia to zoster or shingles, A to Z.
Yeah. And so, and so much of this is in the book. I'm like, people can't see, I'm like tapping the book, which is totally out of frame. But there's a whole subset of, and this is generally what people are talking about when they're talking about microdosing these days. It's like anytime people are talking about psychedelics these days in the mainstream and that sort of discussion, it's all about using them as medicine to treat an illness or to treat a condition, to create a dysfunction. But you go into the book, it's even in the title of the book, for enhanced performance. You go into exploring a whole set of potential uses of microdosing that isn't about correcting that something's wrong. It's about, and I'm going to quote Leo Ralsman, who he used this phrase in a lecture, which I saw him do many years ago. I don't know if he came up with the phrase or what, but it's something to the effect of using psychedelics for the betterment of well people. You talk about the use of microdosing to enhance what's already good.
Mm-hmm.
Why was it important to you to include this in the book? And as a sort of secondary question to that, why is it important for us to consider this as a reason to work with psychedelics, be it microdoses or macrodoses?
Well, let's go back a step, which is, let's take the other 10,000 years of using psychedelics. Okay, all over the planet, anywhere there seemed to be available plants or fungi, they were used. And they were used at two levels. One is they were used in high doses, usually in rituals, in organized settings. And that got the anthropologists to look at them. But also, if you actually talk to people in the village, they'll say, yeah, I use it for, I gave it for my son's headache the other day, and I sprained my ankle and it was very helpful while I was healing. It's part of normal use. Okay, so that's where we start. And the idea that something is only good if you're ill. Imagine all the food supplements. Say, well, don't take sufficient protein unless you're ill. Don't eat eggs. Don't eat vegetables because they're only for people who are sick. Okay, we don't live that way. So again, we didn't intend any part of the book. We intended to look at what people told us. So I remember years ago when I got a very clear thing, I was talking to a bunch of people in San Francisco, and a young man stood up and said, I only use microdosing when I have a coding problem. And there are a number of people in the room going, okay. We have a whole section. We have a lot of people who basically take it to improve their academic performance. There's a lovely story of a guy who flunked his driver's test several times. And then he said, and then I microdosed and I had no problem. Now, he might have just relaxed, done better, had nothing to do with microdosing, but that was his report. And we don't tell people that their report doesn't fit our theory. Real life doesn't work that way.
Sure, you update your theory to fit real life, not the other way around.
You update your information with information. Theory is a high-class word for a guess. For example, there's a guess that depression is a serotonin problem. It's called the serotonin hypothesis. It's not called the serotonin truth. It's called a hypothesis. From that hypothesis, you get a whole set of medications called SSRIs. Even the manufacturers say about 30% of people will have no effect. So it doesn't look like it's a physiological hit. Okay? So it turns out, and there's a little section in the book that ends with the science that we compile, it's all other people's research, that there is no evidence for the serotonin hypothesis. But there are multi-billion-dollar corporations.
The aspirin analogy? Serotonin?
Yeah.
Well, this is, if you take aspirin because you have a headache, but that doesn't mean that there was a lack of aspirin in your body that caused the headache. And so you can analogize that. And, going back to the indigenous people, we know that they microdose for hunting. It improved acuity, resilience, endurance, all of those things. And if you go to the Microdosing Institute of the Netherlands, their website, they have a really nice bit talking about traditional tribes and how some of them have used microdosing. So as Jim said, the reports on performance started with coding, but it's all the way up to now. We heard from Ben Greenfield, who's a big sports nutrition guy, that in the ultra marathoning world, this is people who run 100 miles, that word is very much out that microdosing makes a big difference, and people are taking vast amounts off their times, and they're more resilient, and the pain doesn't bother them as much. My particular feeling is that in nearly every creative art and physical science, that eventually you will see people on the cutting edges, from crocheting to volleyball, and we talk about volleyball in the book. You will see people who are experimenting with what happens when I am feeling a little bit better and have a little bit more neuroplasticity, and can I apply this to this thing that chess players I think are using it, and I think that's just going to grow. So
yeah, and see, if you want a simple image to keep in mind, this is from the martial arts guy who also is PhD. He said, before I microdosed, I got silver medals. Now I get gold. So the idea that you should not improve your health because you're not sick has no basis in anything. Actually, it's just part of the culture because we have a massive illness system and we have a much less developed how to be healthier system.
And even that how to be healthier system is usually trying to leverage people's sense of inadequacy rather than trying to just help someone feeling good to feel better.
Right. And feeling good allows you to do a whole lot of other things. So feeling good is an effective way to improve other parts of your life. Like, I feel so good I can finish my taxes. Okay, now finishing taxes is not something you microdose for. You could, but obviously, feeling good allows you to be better. And the fact that microdosing seems to work that way, and when I always say seems, it's because when you are reading about other people's lives, it's very hard for you to say, well, that doesn't count. Or the word that bothers me usually is that's an anecdote. Anecdote is like a report. How are you? I'm fine. Well, that's just an anecdote. Oh, wait a moment. It's not just an anecdote. It's a summary of a very complicated system into a form that you can hear and understand, and we can get on with our conversation. It isn't well known that depression, for example, is measured only by anecdotes, which means if you're going to a physician for depression, they say, "Are you depressed?" And you say yes. And you say, "Well, how much?" And then, like, on a scale of 1 to 10. That's an anecdote. So when someone writes us, "I was very depressed and now I'm not depressed," that's no different.
I mean, pain as well is anecdotally measured.
Absolutely. It's measured on, I mean, the idea that, there's a pain scale, 1 to 10. How much does it hurt? 7. Now, how does that relate? How does my 7 relate to Jordan's 7? I have no idea. But the entire pain industry is based on the pretend that the numbers somehow track across people.
And another important aspect of the whole performance part is that if you go too high, if you go far beyond a microdose, then the performance doesn't last. If I go to the gym and I take a mini dose, I'm not going to stay focused and have a better workout. I mean, maybe I'll pull one off, but I'm not going to do it on a regular basis. You have to stay in the microdosing range or you're going to lose focus and not do well on whatever you were trying to do your performance on, whether it's coding or chess or volleyball or wrestling, whatever it is. You're going to be too distracted. You're going to be beginning to trip. So of course you're not going to focus as much. So it kind of reinforces this idea that there is a sweet spot, there is this range, and it's important to know what it is and to do your best to keep yourself in it.
I'm not sure this makes sense, but if it's a placebo, why does more suddenly have all these effects?
Well, let's take a moment. I would like to thank my patrons on Patreon who make this show possible. It is through their voluntary contribution to the expenses of the show, hard and soft, that allow me to continue to invest time and money into the production and distribution of this show. I could not be more grateful. You allow me to do something that I love to do, something that I perceive to have value in the world, something that I perceive to offer me the opportunity to feel as though I'm having a valuable impact on the world while also earning an income, earning a living doing so. And I'm very grateful. So thank you very much. The people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube or listed in the description of this episode, wherever you're checking it out, give significantly, some of which for a long time, and the credits are an extra thank you for that. If you listening are not yet a patron and you find value in the show, I invite you to please become a patron on Patreon or to leave a one-time donation on PayPal. As I said before, this is how I earn a living. This is my job. This is what I do. This is what I've put the last decade of my life into trying to better as a skill set and as an offering, as the thing that I invest my working hours into for me, for you, and I mean, fingers crossed, for something more valuable than either of us that we have yet to see come into fruition in some way or another. And I don't rely on advertising. I don't have a big enough following to push for big sponsorships or anything like that. It's a small-time show. It's a small-time operation. And you, as a listener, really have a significant impact when you contribute financially to the show, to the production of the show, and to my ability to literally and figuratively eat. So I thank you very much for taking the time to head over to patreon.com/James W. Jesso to become a member. Something as little as a cup of coffee once a month, like the cost of a cup of coffee once a month, $2 to $4, really makes a difference. And the more you contribute, the sort of more inside access. I mean, you know how this stuff works. This has been going on for a long time. I'm sure you have other people that you've probably supported. I just doubt this is the first time you've been given the opportunity to be invited to somebody's Patreon. So I won't explain it much further. You know how it works. And you also know that it would make a positive impact on my life, financial well-being, and the future production and consistency and hurrah of this show. So I thank you for doing that. If contributing once a month does not make sense, you could toss me a tip for this episode in the form of a one-time donation via PayPal, which also makes a big difference. And that's all. Let's get back into this interview with Jordan and Jim. I hope you're enjoying it so far. And that's all. Back in. Here we go. So let's go to the question that you knew I was going to ask. From a couple of minutes ago about the gut. the microbiome, our sort of our ecology of non-animal cells that exists, in us, that has a significant contribution to everything from mood and cognitive function to just physiological function in our whole body. Quite a lot of the neurotransmitters that are in our body are produced in our stomach, and even our stomach themselves has receptors to detect neurotransmitters. People make this claim that the gut is like a second brain, but I'd say the gut is like the gut, and it also functions like a brain. But that's just my sort of clarification. But this is something that I have thought about for a long time, and I hadn't really got any good information about it yet. And you guys mentioned it in your book, which is that when we're consuming psychedelics, for the most part, especially when it comes to mushrooms, which tend to, relative to LSD, quite a lot more volume going in, that it must be having some effect on the gut directly. What's your thoughts on that? Do you think that microdosing, some of its benefits at least, might be a direct effect from its impact on our gut or on our microbiome?
We just say yes and smile and agree with you.
Well, what we know is if your microbiome affects everything else that we've been able to measure its effect, that microdosing will affect it. You're also asking us to step out of our world of saying all we know is real world evidence into a kind of current accepted theory. And I remember very early when the microbiome was being discovered, the problem science said is there's too many organisms in there to do the measuring that we know how to do. That how do you describe the interactions between 10,000 different species, not only bacteria and not only viruses, but it turns out there's something smaller and that is quasi-life like viruses. And it's a whole nother family of thinglets. And they found one of them, and then they found 8 of them, and then they found 1,000 of them. And so the notion that we know much about what goes on inside of here is still very small. The possibility that if something is going to every cell of the body, that any of the little critters in your microbiome that would benefit from it will want to eat it is 100%. How to measure that or talk about it just depends on your vocabulary and your charm, not on data.
Hmm.
And one of the things.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I asked a very broad question there, and you tackled one aspect of it. Another aspect is, do you think it's possible that there's some activation of the sort of receptor sites in the gut? And for example, we have serotonin receptor sites in the gut. I could be wrong on that, so please correct me if I am. That when we're bringing in psilocybin, I'm thinking mushrooms in particular, because I can't imagine a whole lot of LSD is making it all the way down into our intestines before it's absorbed into our bloodstream, but that it could be having an effect through that direct activation as well as getting into the bloodstream and through the blood-brain barrier.
Absolutely. Why not? Why wouldn't it? See, that's another way of doing science, which is try assuming that it's so. Does that make more sense than assuming that this substance, which pervades every cell of the body, would somehow miss the intestines? Right. So, from a common sense point of view, I'll give you another. Since you want us to go out on a limb, here's one. Okay. It looks to me, I'm a quote psychologist. It looks to me like considerable amount of what's called mental illness will be alleviated over the next decades by improving the biome. There.
There's research now that we have that. Yeah.
True. Remember, once you let go of the serotonin hypothesis, the problem of depression is just as strong as ever. And you then say, well, what do you then go say to indigenous people and say, what do you do about depression? And they tell you very often it'll be with physical items like psychedelics and so forth and so on. So the idea that the microbiome isn't part of the psychedelic microdose and high dose seems contrary to wisdom, to logic, and to science.
And it would be cool if we found out that, 200 million neurons in the enteric system and 200 billion something in the whole CNS. If there are very specific things that people figure out that are going on, that'll be really cool and interesting. Specific ways that neurons in the enteric system are triggered differently. So, I'm sure people will be onto that.
Hmm. I'm such a nerd for that kind of stuff. So me too. I'm like, ooh, I'm so excited for that research to be done, such that we have some. I find a lot of value in the real world evidence that you're talking about, and I also love nerding out on the sort of like tunnel vision that reveals something that only machines could measure in a highly controlled context. So that aside, speaking of data sets and research. Sort of study models and structures, there's been this kind of like growing narrative that kind of between LSD and psilocybin, they're kind of like the same, they just have, psilocybin is just a little bit shorter, so it's more ideal for therapeutic use, but they're kind of indistinguishable from each other. That is something that somebody studying LSD and psilocybin based on gatherings of, various reports and finding commonalities in the language and looking for lowest common denominator in a very specific context, looking for a very specific answer is going to find. But if you ask people who have taken psilocybin and LSD, especially in any sufficient measure, they will say, no, they are not the same. Like they're so different. They offer different things, different experiences, different outcomes, etc. Your book, you generally are, outside of instances where you clarify one protocol uses this and one uses that, or that research revealed this about that one, and so forth. You kind of generally talk about LSD and psilocybin kind of as just the microdosing psychedelics. Those are the ones. But is there anything that you've seen or noticed in the data set that you had that pointed out that one was seemingly better or had more benefits for certain domains or conditions than the other?
Let's start with hard science, okay? Because then we can dismiss hard science and get back to real world evidence. We have two studies. One measured every physiological thing they could think of to distinguish between LSD and psilocybin. And they came up with that there was one predominant difference. Hold your breath. Psilocybin doesn't last as long. Okay, they found that out. There was another study, and God bless these people because they're willing to do a lot of really boring work for our benefit. And it was measuring every psychological measure they could: cognitive flexibility, memory, mood. And they discovered that there was a difference between psilocybin and LSD. And you already have guessed it. Yes, psilocybin didn't last as long. Okay? So now we've handled objective science. Now we go into the community of users who may have 40 or 50 years of use. And we find there's a very clear understanding in that community of the differences. And the differences seem to be, again, report, that if you're thinking about what should I take and you have the luxury of choosing, which is not that easy, if the thing that interests you has to be somewhat of an emotional nature, that psilocybin is preferred. Psilocybin is kinder and perhaps has a plant spirit behind it. For things of a cognitive nature, problem-solving philosophy, theology, coding, certainly, LSD seems to be preferred by this same very large group. That makes sense to us. Now, we don't distinguish that in the book predominantly because for what all the things we've covered in the book, it doesn't show up particularly.
Most people don't have a choice between what they're going to have access to
in the first place. And when you have 10 people who've used LSD for depression and 10 people who've used psilocybin, and you can't distinguish their reports, it looks like it has they generally overlap. But that's that subtle difference, which, as I say, isn't measurable in the scientific sense, but is well understood in the world of long-term users. So that's the best we can do, is give you the information as we get it.
So the way I like to put it is that most people report that LSD is more of a non-specific amplifier. It will work on and focus on anything you put your mind to, while psilocybin really does want to teach you and heal you and get you to work on your heart and your emotions and whatever you need to do on some level to evolve. And it very well may have some sort of teacher spirit or plant spirit behind it. We talk about this ADHD for, at night protocol, and our friend Wendy, who's a coach and works with business people who have ADHD, she very much prefers psilocybin to LSD. She finds that when people are taking LSD for ADHD, that they get more scattered and it doesn't work as well. And that, yeah, sure, they may focus on one thing, but it might be the wrong thing. And so, but these, as Jim said, for most people and most of the time, either one is going to work for most things.
And my assumption is that taking even a small dose of LSD in the evening is not, if I think about my own experiences, my anticipation is that would not positively benefit my sleep because of dopaminergic activity that LSD has. But
remember, the dopamine activity is theory. Okay, theory. You believe it. That's called placebo. Remember? Okay. So you believe that if you take LSD at night, it will affect your sleep negatively. Fortunately, people who don't know as much as you do, who have been told that a lot of people seem to have used LSD successfully for night issues, and a lot of people have used psilocybin for night issues, it works pretty well. Now, it might be that psilocybin works better, but the same dopamine thing you were about to say would work for psilocybin. So you have to be careful when we talk theory, because the theory controls our behavior. And the question is the theory based on real life experience, or is it what is called the theory, which is, this is a good guess. And this happens to be an area that I work in. And I find that with fruit flies, I've got some evidence, not very strong, in the way my theory would like to go. One of the reasons I think I'm particularly not prone to theory is when you have a theory, you start focusing on what you can find in the evidence world that matches your theory. And that immediately shrinks your capacity to observe. So we have a theory that microdosing helps people. So when people write in and say, I'm having a terrible experience, we don't say, well, that's just one of the things that happens. We actually say, you're not the first letter that wrote in with something terrible. What we found, we used to just say to people, well, it's not for you. Nothing is for everybody. Now we say, try cutting your dose in half. And if you still have the same symptoms, cut it in half again. And if you still have the same symptoms, then it's not for you. But we found that maybe 85% of the people that write back and say, oh, thank you very much. I guess I need less than I was taking. So we're tending to be very, very cautious at theories for which there is no very substantial work. And when there's counter evidence from real life experience. So I urge you to cut your dose of LSD in half and you might sleep very well.
So one more thing to mention about the difference between LSD and psilocybin is that if you have access to it, in some ways, LSD is easier to dose and less problematic. No one has any stomach issues ever with LSD. Some varieties of psilocybin, as you know, are 2 or 3 times stronger. And if you don't know that and you take it, you could very well find yourself in a mini dose, especially if it's blended with chocolate. and also people who are in less good health in terms of their stomach and intestines and whatnot, they need a higher dose of psilocybin to get to the same place. So if you happen to be a healthy person who gets a dose of albino penis envy, it might be not at all a microdose. So, with LSD, a lot of these questions kind of go away. It's just one molecule. If it's LSD, either it is or it isn't. And if it's correctly measured and you know how to create the microdose, then it's sort of simpler.
Now, I should say the reason I went down your throat with the dopamine.
I have a response, but continue.
I totally agreed with you a number of years ago. Obviously, if you're feeling more energy, obviously, then you shouldn't use it for sleep. And only when people were using it successfully for sleep did I have to say, am I going to take my theory, which I like a lot? Am I going to take reality, which isn't as good? But I've found over the years that I can always come up with another theory. I know that, we really got psychedelics from outer space civilizations, and it's their way of trying to save us from extinction. But that doesn't change the dopamine problem.
You weren't supposed to reveal that to anybody.
They told me. All right, whatever.
I was going to include it in the intro anyway. So
exactly. Right.
So, and one place you see a lot of theory is, and I know you're going to be coming to this, is all of the possible dangers and the alarms that are risen with respect to people even microdosing.
Right.
So many things can go wrong and terrible.
Even
people have theories.
Even though it's a placebo and has no effect, it has serious negative effects.
Well, I mean, to your comment to your comment about the dopamine, I think it's a fair point, because even if I expand my mind to think about every body is different, some things work in some context for some people and not in others. If I have caffeine after 2 p.m., man, I'm done. I'm not sleeping. That's it. But my partner, she can have a cup of coffee at 9 or 10, and then she's usually ready to go to sleep. My dad too, he has a cup of coffee and then he goes to bed. So some people,
I'm sure these people you see are not real, because I share your theory. Okay? Right. I'm not going to believe that the person you live with could do something wildly different physiologically, because science doesn't do that.
But I don't know. I'll have to go back and check. But I from what I understand, and I tried to look into this, LSD does have some effect. It does have a binding effect on dopamine. Whether or not that results in stimulation to sleep, now that is a theory. And so I stand by that. But it's not, I don't believe it's theoretical that it affects dopamine. LSD or psilocybin, on the other hand, has no direct effect on dopamine that we know of. So that might be a difference, whether or not that changes whether or not someone sleeps. That's really, I can't say that.
For the physiological and psychological science that we talked about. So there's an enormous amount that we pretend we know. And it's always awkward when the theory turns out to not make any sense at all, because people have invested years in a theory. And I'm remembering from my graduate work, I had a professor who had a popular theory, and he would have graduate students do studies to prove it. And when they didn't work, he'd say, well, do another one. And it turns out if you do enough studies, like flipping coins, you'll get the answer you want if you'll wait long enough. You just have to throw away all the ones that didn't work. And it was a very good lesson that theory should open your eyes, but once it's your theory, then it's much harder to let in new information.
You start defending it.
Especially if your career is based on that theory being true. Right?
Exactly. Well, one of the places we're seeing a theoretical idea is certain aspects of the psychedelic leadership is stuck on the idea that the only real way to make a difference in something like treatment-resistant depression is using high doses with a therapist. And they're very invested in that theory, and that's what didn't work out with the FDA and MDMA, and we're finding it's the opposite. You don't need that.
Now, but all you get with what we read is the depression goes away. No insights, no trauma relieved, no understanding, just not being depressed. And we really had people that say, but that, you can feel that, but you can't be undepressed if you don't deal with the cause. Well, maybe the cause was your biome.
Sure. Or neural
And
inflammation.
and in talk therapy, you're resting, you're lying down. Maybe that is what all that's working. And we do know, there's a famous book title from on psychotherapy. It's called The Purchase of Friendship. What you get when you get therapy is somebody who will listen to you. And that turns out to be incredibly therapeutic, no matter what else is going on, which is, I used to wonder why people who were terrible therapists seem to have a good practice, is they probably didn't say much except, oh, and that really is incredibly therapeutic. So we really live in a world where there are different kind of interest groups pushing various different theoretical suggestions. We try very hard to say, when we don't know something because nobody's told us, we don't make it up. And we don't try and fit it into a grander scheme. Neuroplasticity, probably. Other things that my friend in the martial arts, I know what he's doing better because he's explained it to me. He can see the next move a tenth of a second sooner than he could see it before. I don't think that's easily measurable, but the end effect of getting a gold versus a silver is very easily measurable. So you start with what's easily understood, and you don't then you only need theory if you don't know. There's no theory about how many planets there are. There are comments about there might be other planets, but there's no theory because we know. There's no theory about the weight of gold.
And not having a theory lets us be open to more information. So we have a website. It's microdosingbook.com, microdosingbook.com. We invite people to send us stories and to ask us questions. And we got this report from this person who had 40 different major surgeries since he was a kid. And he's been in terrible pain his whole life. And he realized on his own that if he took a microdose of LSD and a microdose of psilocybin every day, his pain was gone. Well, that doesn't fit any of our models or theories or guesses. And yet we have it. We're certain he's not making it up. And do we know where that's going to go? Is that going to work with other people? We have no idea. But, we were open to that because we're not defending anything. We're just taking the information in and then giving it to other people so they can decide if it's something that they're interested in or might want to try.
That's our rant.
Well, don't worry. I want more of your rant. I want to corral it a little bit here. So I want to ask you about two substances, plants, molecules, that you didn't mention in the book that I got a lot of people asking, like, hey, can we just hear what their comments are on it? And the two are ibogaine and San Pedro or Huachuma, which you mentioned earlier, Jordan. Separating the two, and I mean, don't feel like you have to go too far into this, but don't necessarily skip anything you think is important. What did you get out of the data set, or based on the research that you did in preparing for the book? Like, what do you know about ibogaine microdosing?
Yeah. Let's do Chacuna San Pedro first because that's easy.
Okay. Yeah.
In the United States, there's a cactus called peyote. Major alkaloid is mescaline. It's Schedule 1, which means no known medical uses. That's not true. And high possibility for addiction. That's not true. Okay? But that's the way the law reads, and it's illegal. Except, of course, if you're a Native American and so forth and so on. Okay? So understand we've got two realities already with this. San Pedro, the major alkaloid, is mescaline. Owning a San Pedro cactus is 100% legal. Distilling it down to the mescaline somehow turns it into an illegal substance. And I checked on this. If you want to know, I guess in the United States, where to get this secret San Pedro cactus from South America, I found Amazon just fine. Also, by the way, just if you're working on Amazon, because I did this one day, is what can you buy on Amazon? LSD is a semi-synthetic. Lysergic acid amide, which has the identical effects but 1/100th the power is found in certain series of morning glory seeds and Hawaiian rose seeds. Wood rose seeds. Okay. Again, there was a wonderful moment when I was looking at this, and I was looking at the morning glory seeds, and there was a company and people were putting in the reviews. And the reviews were, I used it on the back fence. My house looks beautiful. I'm using it up and down the driveway. It's just gorgeous. And then the other company, people were saying, man, this is really good stuff. Okay? So we have to be a little careful on those kind of questions. So chacuna is made, basically, it's known throughout South America. It grows pretty easily. Peyotes should be protected for the Native Americans for whom it is their sacred substance. Now, ibogaine. Ibogaine was available in France during the 1930s in a tincture for energy. It was just something that was sold. It seems to be remarkable in helping people overcome serious drug addictions in a supportive setting. And that's fantastic. The word microdose doesn't appear much with ibogaine. I have been told about it, that taking it so you're basically staying friends with the spirit, but not specific microdose uses, but maybe Jordan is more up on it than I am.
No, well, I know there's groups out there that are very much talking about microdosing ibogaine, and they're building their own protocols, but we don't know really enough about that to comment on it at this point. And it's also interesting to realize that ibogaine is an extract from the iboga plant, so it's a different thing. It's already been kind of changed and manufactured and concentrated. So that's another nuance.
And there are plants similar to the iboga plant, which seem to have similar results, or at least so I'm told online, and I can get it 50% off if I order within the next 20 minutes. So I'm not sure. So, and some of these companies are very good. Just as ayahuasca has all kinds of uses, and there's all kinds of research, and there's a lot of use of just the Banisteriopsis caapi, the vine, separate. And with the shamans saying, yeah, that's where the healing is. There's a group in Peru that is made up of people with academic training and so forth, and shamans, and they work together. And they say, but in some countries, ayahuasca is illegal. In South America, where we're helping people, the shamans say, just use the Banisteriopsis caapi. And they say, but what's the difference? They say, well, the DMT plant, and there's a number of them throughout South America that are used, that's where you get all the visuals and all the kind of amazing events. And the other people say, well, how about healing? I say, no, the healing is just in the Banisteriopsis caapi. And that's what they're finding. So again, you have people trained to do microdosing with Banisteriopsis caapi, which you didn't ask for, but you would. Lots of reports, but just from those groups letting me know what they're doing. So we don't have individual, the kind of data that we prefer. And again, the book was absolutely everything that was ever known until we had to stop writing.
Sure.
We have a whole nother file of fascinating things that have come in since then.
Well, I'm definitely interested as things come in, as things start to expand out and we get more data set on, say, microdosing, things like the various 2C compounds, and more on ibogaine and some of the possibilities there, which I hear you don't have much data such that you could speak confidently on it. And then I assume the same is for huachuma, the San Pedro, is like you don't have enough of a data set to be able to comment on it as a specific, like a unique source of microdosing, that it kind of still fits in the same benefits, but not enough to differentiate anything specific. Is that fair?
Well, we know, for instance, we don't have a distinction between synthetic mescaline and mescaline derived from peyote or Pedro. For example, we do have, finally, after many years, because nobody on either side wanted to do it, questions of whether synthetic psilocybin is as good as psilocybin from the living mushroom with the other alkaloids.
Right.
And the answer is the mushrooms that you buy are superior in all cases that have been measured for effectiveness and so forth than synthetic. Not surprising.
Yeah.
It evolved with all those chemicals. So
right. I figure when nature has 30 or 40 million years to work it out, probably it's working about right.
Sure.
But that's,
I mean, hard to argue with. It's better. It's usually better to eat the whole vegetable than to just extract the components you think are good and assume it's going to be the same thing. I want to go in before we have a kind of limited time, and I want to ask about 3 specific, maybe 4 specific things if we can get it in. So we'll try to keep it pretty tight here, so I can end with the question about concerns and possible dangers. I'll tell you what the 4 are in advance, so we can go through them relatively quickly. They're ADHD, brain injury / concussion, dementia, and fun, which is a weird word to finish off after dementia. And so I'll ask you them individually. And these are all ones that I'm asking because, pardon my capitalizing on an opportunity for personal gain here, but those are the 4 that I know that I'm particularly concerned about, and they are ones that people have asked me about as well. Starting with ADHD. Now, this is a very specific question. You already said that it appears as though some people speak to, LSD isn't usually the best one, or your colleague said it's usually not the best one for ADHD. Okay. And she presents this very specific protocol of taking psilocybin at night / in the evening. Can you tell me what is that protocol? Because I looked through the book, I looked online, I couldn't find what it is. Is that an every 4th day? Is it just before bed? Is it early in the afternoon? Can you tell me what is this protocol of microdosing psilocybin for ADHD?
I'm pretty sure it's taking it late in the evening, 8, 9, 10 o'clock, and then going to sleep. And then you wake up the next day and have your more focused day. I think it's that simple.
Yeah. And therefore, it would be any of the other protocols.
So it could be every 4th day, every other day, 3 days or 4 days on, 3 days off. Okay. Because I think in your book, you did say it was in the evening, but it didn't say what time in the evening.
Well, ADHD, for most people that we've got huge reports from people who are on ADHD medications. And we should let you know, and it's a kind of scary thing, is at what age, this is the US government, suggests that people be given ADHD medications, which are almost entirely amphetamines, speed.
Yeah, amphetamines and then methylphenidate, yeah.
Age 3.
Age 3?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the correct response, which is, oh my God, are you really? Did you make that up?
That's
and when we read it, we said the same thing. Then if you look at what's in the 3 to 5 range, like 50,000 American children, how often, if you're on those medications, do you take them daily? For how long? A lifetime. Mm-hmm. Are there side effects? You bet.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
So that's where we are. ADHD used to be considered a child, basically a young person's problem, and people would grow out of it. We no longer say that. So what we found is people microdose in all the ways we've mentioned, and they report that it isn't quite as effective in terms of focus as amphetamines, but it's a hell of a lot better for you. And we just have, again, many, many people saying, I've been on, these medications for years, I'm now off them. So that's the general round of reports. That it's an effective alternative to medication. We also have a number of people who said, I don't know if I'm diagnosed with ADHD, but I have all the symptoms that my friends who are diagnosed. And they again say, I went from no medication to microdosing successfully. So the reason it's a large section in the book is we have a lot of reports, and it offers ADHD people an alternative to a medication that handles their major symptoms at the cost of a lot of other problems. So that's pretty much ADHD.
And I assume part of the benefit of this evening dose is so that you're actually like the benefits you're looking to get on your ADHD symptoms in your most productive part of the day is the second day effect. So you're trying to optimize for the second
Right.
day
And
effect.
that's one coach and one way of working.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. It is definitely not. It's not preferred or not preferred. When you work with a coach or you work with a therapist or you work with whatever you work with, you tend to think, that's why I'm here is for their way of working. So we don't make that distinction as a necessity. I mean, it isn't a special way of working. Many people just because, again, many people wake up and they take their ADHD medication. So we're saying if you're going to do that, try microdosing as an alternative and see for you what your choice is. Now, what's curious is that here is a substance, and this is again why we don't like the pharmaceutical model, doesn't make sense. ADHD is helped by amphetamines. The other major area, big chapter in the book, is depression, which is a totally different set of medications. And remember, they have their own little hypothesis. And microdoses seem to help depression pretty much the way they help ADHD, getting people off medications. Huge use is actually what's called tapering, getting people off medications that either no longer work or the side effects aren't worth it. And we're talking very large populations. So I bring the two together because that's peculiar if you're saying it has to be pharmaceutical because these drugs and these drugs are 100% apart. However, they both mask mental issues. And so if the mental issues go away, then you don't need the mask. So ADHD.
So let me go on to the next one here in this list. It's brain injury, particular concussion, not any serious hemorrhaging or damage. We're talking so-called mild TBI. Because
we're not talking about major damage to the physical cells of the brain.
Correct. That's what I'm asking about. I'm asking like more minor, generally looked at as functional damage, or, like a secondary injury could result in more significant damage over time. But there is some data coming out that I believe it's mostly anecdotal right now, that larger doses of psilocybin seem to have significant positive effects on people who are in the long tail of being stuck in sort of post-concussion symptoms. Was there much reports coming in through your online survey and so forth that showcased people specifically using it for brain injury or concussion, or found that afterwards they realized, hey, this actually helped with this? Like, what data do you have on that?
You do? Yeah, go ahead. Well, the data we have started with a Heisman Trophy hockey player who was the enforcer for the team. Enforcer, for those of you that don't know hockey, means you start the fights.
Yeah.
He retired, as people do in his occupation, at about age 30 because of multiple concussions. He was asked on a sports program, how many concussions did you have? He says 7 official. He said, how about others? He said about 100. He therefore spent 2 years going to every therapy clinic to help people with brain damage because he could afford it, and spent a couple of $100,000. And after 2 years, he was sitting in the garden figuring out, for his family's sake, given how it was to live with him, how suicide would be beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Very shortly thereafter, someone recommended that he look into psychedelics. He had a high dose, followed by learning about microdosing. And he moved from being basically but not only incompetent, but awful to be with, to being a remarkably astute businessman, juggling a number of things as he began a company called Wisana, based in Canada, specifically set up to help people with TBIs. Because what happens in normal life is when you have a brain injury, the assumption is the brain doesn't heal. And you get walkarounds because the brain's very flexible and you can relearn to do all the things that part of the brain did. And that's more or less effective. What we're finding, and again, his reports the reports of the subjects that he ran, and then now he has a clinic in Oregon, is that the brain seems to be able to heal itself so that lost facilities or faculties are returned. Just one other, the kind of stories that were interest us. This is someone who's working with a coach. Again, of sports, retired, concussions. He was finding most of his time was in the dark of his bedroom because the headache pain was the least there. Okay. After microdosing, he came out of the bedroom and started to resume his life, began to be functional and social, and actually met someone and they fell in love and they got married and he stopped microdosing. So that's the kind of data that we find hopefully would interest the people who spend their lives trying to help these people with TBIs. And TBIs are incredibly more common than people wish to acknowledge, particularly in children through sports.
And the fact that high doses might be helpful isn't,
makes sense.
Doesn't conflict with the fact that microdosing works too. And, it's just where you want to go and how you want to work with it. But there's very intriguing anecdotal data about TBIs and also the whole headache realm, both cluster headaches and migraines. Microdosing seems to be very effective with. So, again, we're seeing these kind of whole body system healings on even things that are very difficult and that nobody 15 years ago thought microdosing would have any impact on.
Now, and the problem with high doses is they're probably more effective than a small dose if you only did it once. And as you pointed out early in the program, you can't do high doses very often. And they take the whole day and you need staff and so forth and so on. So what we're looking at is there a way in which people with traumatic brain injury can basically take care of healing themselves? And it makes sense if we're talking about the regrowth of damaged tissue that the body needs time to do that. So that's, again, all we have is reports and people actually making both a business and then a clinic out of helping other people. So we can't say that, that's all we can say is it helps some people. And what people don't know is after brain injury, you're given about 2 years of therapies. And then they say, that's all that we're pretty sure you're not going to get any better. So those are some of the people who then end up microdosing. I got interested because one night at a MAPS event, some guy talked to me and he said, I've used microdosing and I'm so much better. From what? He said, the headaches. Where'd you get the headaches from? From the car injury. How long was the car injury? A couple of years ago. I had all the therapy that I could get and my insurance company was very generous and I was left with the headaches. And now I don't have the headaches.
So, I mean, I'm gonna hold back wild horses here on my inclination to theorize, with the with the intersections here
in there, and I hope that you get better someday.
We have headaches, cluster headaches, migraines, brain injuries, concussions, issues. There's clearly some overlap there. Also goes into some overlap, I assume, with dementia. And so my inclination to hold back the theorizing is, around like what psychedelics, small or larger doses, are doing to brain function and brain tissue and the nutrients available to the brain such that changes can happen. And then trying to theorize what we do or don't know about dementia, how it comes to be and how it presents and what we have for treatment. So you're welcome to go down that road if you want. I'm going to hold back. But my question is specifically to dementia.
Got it.
Around its prevention and or its active treatment once it's sort of on board with respect to microdosing.
Let's step back and quote. And again, science is a little skitsy here, which is dementia is physical. And here's the way you can stop having it. Crossword puzzles, learn a language, square dancing, having relationships. Okay? Doesn't work if you break your leg, by the way. All those don't work. So some physical things are physical. Dementia, obviously, is a mind-body issue. I don't have a theory, but I have a point of view.
Okay.
Point of view is we have a few incredible miracle stories of people coming out of dementia for a number of hours and being much more functional. From not having spoken for a month to remembering the lyrics of jazz music from 35 years ago, enough to sing them. Okay?
This is with exposure to music, not with the microdosing.
Oh, this is the microdose.
Okay, all right.
Okay, that's why it's a miracle story. Okay? And as far as we know, return to the comatose state. So we have a little bit of awareness that something, again, with all the mental possibilities that the dementia people talk about, that microdosing might be helpful. We don't have enough information, but at the end of the book, we have, as one has to in such a book, saying, make some speculation so that 5 years from now, everyone will laugh at you. So that was one of mine, is that it looks like dementia can be helped. It looks like we also, I think, got in just before the book closed, palliative care, which is, there is research being done in Canada by the palliative physicians in hospitals designed for it, including microdosing at the end of life. What we know, and this is just of interest, at the end of life, most people are in terrible pain. Most people don't have to be in terrible pain because morphine actually cuts that pain out. And as people are dying in hospice, they're made as comfortable as possible. Morphine also blurs consciousness. As your relatives come in to say goodbye, they don't get much contact. What he has found is that if these patients are given microdoses, morphine is unchanged, they are able to come back out to some extent, recognize their relatives, talk, say those magnificently important things. I've never been able to tell you, Dad, but I always wanted you to know that even though I left you, I still love you. Those incredible moments, which last for the lifetime of the people hearing them, is improved with microdosing. Do people live longer? Not likely. But it cuts through something that is clouding consciousness. And that's intriguing. And for those of you who would like to start theorizing, that's, I think, a very good place to start.
And it may be that there's a specific protocol or that work with one specific substance. I had a friend who had a vision of one of the substances that we barely mentioned today. And in her vision, that was the one that was going to end up being the dementia preventative. But we're very early and we don't really know, but it seems like it, almost like it should. Or maybe I just wanted to, and that's wishful thinking.
Yeah, I mean, based on everything I know about what psychedelics seem to do for the brain, like the little bit I know about dementia, it would seem very logical that we would find that it would be effective in prevention and treatment.
The thing is, logically, it makes sense since it improves awareness. We have a couple of interesting cases to look at. And this is kind of, hello, researchers out there, if that interests you. Also, people with elderly relatives or being the elderly relatives, you're in Canada, you're not, you're able to get things you're allowed to heal yourself by your constitution. Mm-hmm. This is something to look at, and we don't know. See, the nice thing is with microdosing, I'm saying, well, why don't you try this? And you think, well, my goodness, this is medication. All those little terrible things that happen. Microdosing has very few effects that can be measured physically. So it seems to have a very large risk-reward ratio, which is low risk. Psychedelics themselves are among the safest substances we know of. Microdoses are that much safer. So when I say it could be tried, that's why I'm so cavalier about it. So you're going to ask about concerns when we get through one more of those things. And I warn you, we're not going to need to spend a lot of time.
So with that, do you guys have time for me to ask you this last thing before we get to concerns? I don't want to.
Yeah, another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're going to need to wrap it up.
Awesome. So everyone's favorite reason for anything, which is fun. What about microdosing, specifically for the joy like accessing greater joy. And on this, we've got the added question of like just doing something for pure recreation, be it micro or macro or otherwise. Like, what about using microdoses for just having more fun?
More fun performance, right?
Yeah, increasing my fun performance.
We were interviewed by a guy named Andy Frasco. His band is Andy Frasco in the UN. He's got this great line that goes, "I miss getting high just to get high. Now I've got to get stoned just to get by." And that's sort of, he's great. You should listen to his album, Optimist 2024. I really dig this guy and his music. But I'm on board with you. I think that, that's what people are doing who are using it and going hiking, or, maybe they'll be taking a higher dose. But sure, you could definitely have more fun on microdosing, whether it's because what you're doing, you're loving. I mean, I've noticed that music is certainly even more interesting in general, and, going out and being in nature and all of that stuff is definitely, you're more present. It's better.
Yeah. I mean, the nice thing is, think about kids. We somehow consider that they're supposed to have fun, and then somehow we lose track of that. How do they have fun? They use their bodies, they use their minds, they play with reality. I'm a ghost. No, I'm a ghost. I'm a bigger ghost than you are. Okay, for 10 minutes, we'll do that. Fun is, I'm trying not to say fun is fundamental, but there it is.
Oh,
come on.
Fun with fungi is fundamental.
Let's put the fun back in fungi as the Santa Cruz fungi festival every year. Put the fun back in fungi. In this case, we're saying let's put fungi back so there's more fun. The idea that the substance makes your life better. See, that's again that kind of Puritan. You have to wait to be sick to be better.
Mm-hmm.
And those of us who have enough things wrong with our bodies know that's a really bad system. That what it doesn't give you is the psychedelic breakthrough, where you look at a coffee cup and an hour later you have known this coffee cup your whole life and have had several romantic liaisons during the hour, and you'll never forget it. That's a high dose.
But it might bring you back into the part of you that really loves drinking coffee or really loves listening to music. So I definitely think that, this goes back to the general notion that microdosing not only makes bad things less bad, but it makes good things better. That's because it's working with the whole system in all these different ways that we've talked about. It's not just trying to, work with one symptom and finding a specific way to repress it, like with SSRIs. And, we're going to put a wrench in the system so more of it isn't uptaken. But of course, that has bad effects because you put a wrench in the system. But, it's not like that. It's working on all of these different positive ways. So I would definitely say there is more fun. There is more presence, that people are doing more of what they love, whatever that is. And we talk about the skiing people. The skiing people love microdosing and skiing because it's just, they're already having fun.
So the other thing is we have a little section called social microdosing. And that's because people are now using it instead of alcohol. And what we're learning is, and it's really fun, is if there are weddings now where you go, and as you enter, there's this lovely long table with chocolates. And you understand that's instead of alcohol. And people are saying, I love being able to take a microdose at a party. I don't end up saying stupid things and throwing up. And I drive home. So it is becoming a method of social intercourse, of social pleasure. And this was a couple of years ago, an article in a Los Angeles paper, somebody who makes chocolates with microdoses for weddings. He says, I do 5,000 pieces a month, not 5,000 weddings, 5,000 pieces of chocolate. So it's out there as a way of making your life better in a positive way. And it also is an alcohol substitute, because we all know that alcohol is fun, but somewhat deceptive and physiologically terrible.
Well, I mean, at this point now you're talking about what I've heard someone describe as a Peri-threshold dose. Like now you're getting into a place when you're talking about like taking it at like a wedding or something. Chances are people aren't going for that, oh, there's no peeking through the veil or kind of getting into.
Remember, it's below threshold.
But what I'm saying is that
bride and groom, and they don't see a whole lot of other stuff.
Right, but what I'm saying is that
what we've been told. We don't know the full doses. They tell us it's microdoses.
But sure, if you're going to do museum dosing or going with psychedelics is a big thing. A lot of people for that specific, they might want a little bit more. Sure.
Right. Right.
Nothing
so
wrong
what I'm
with
saying
that.
is what you're speaking to is a domain of use that sort of opens up into this realm of dosage that isn't micro, and it isn't the sort of larger doses. That is its own kind of like place. It's not taking you really deep, and it's not a microdose, but it does have access to these things.
And I don't want to be kind of word silly, but again, we're limited. See, we can't do what you just did. We're limited by what people tell us. So when they tell us that it is microdoses, we have to assume that either there's no reason for them to lie. Okay. So it looks to us that social microdosing exists as an alternative socially. And I know someone who actually caters some parties. And I say, how much do people take? She says, and it's about an ounce of her particular drink mixture, which is herbs and a psychedelic. And it's about, she said, it's about a microdose. But remember, microdose has a range. It's not it's a range of how much there is. And this, indeed, your guess is as good as mine that the high end of the range is likely. But I don't know.
Well, for your data set, I can say that I know people who very much also like to skirt the edge of slightly above the microdose, but not into the full dose, which I've heard described as this sort of Peri-threshold dose, usually for specifically recreation or for something a little bit more than a microdose can offer without the destabilization of like a full dose, such as psychedelic, Jordan, like you just mentioned, art, museum doses, etc., which is something for the people in the comments to this thing to theorize on their own time, I suppose, if they want.
I'd like to know, again, microdosingbook.com, one word. We'd love your stories of interesting ways that you're using either a microdose or above. That's, as you can tell from this program, that's all we've got. And, I'm holding back a couple of really incredibly juicy things that have come in the last week or two because we don't really have the time, but we're investigating them for other conditions. So that's how this all happens, is we talk to people like you who have audiences like yours who then tell us something that we don't know. And then when we talk to someone else, we say, well, last week we got this great letter from this guy in Canada who does this program. And this person who's a 65-year-old retired logger says, and so forth.
So I'm already taking too much of your time here. So I'm going to ask this question because I know that it's important and you've already mentioned it, and as you said, it's going to be quick. And then we'll close up, which is, what are the dangers of microdosing? Like, how safe is this thing? And of course, the most glaring danger that gets proposed is that it causes potential damage to the heart valve. What, based on the information you have, what do we know as being the genuine dangers microdosing might present to somebody, short or long term?
I don't know. Heart valve is out there, kind of like a meme. The only problem with the heart valve is there's no evidence. Let me say that again. We have no evidence. We have 40 million people in the United States that have used psychedelics since it first became illegal. We have no evidence. We do have evidence that something vaguely like a psychedelic was taken in doses approximately 10,000 times what an LSD dose would have been over a period of months. And people on that substance, and it was a weight loss drug, some of them had a heart valve problem and the drug was withdrawn. The last article I read, and it was a really lovely article, which said, we're sure that it's a real problem. Here are 84 references, and here are 2 tables listing substances and what we know about them. And I looked at the table and there were some holes in it. It said, we have no information about psilocybin. We have no information about LSD. So that's where we are. And I did write one of the guys that started this whole thing. And I said, where did you get any information? And he said, well, it was this other study years ago, and there was another one with MDMA where people took massive doses of MDMA for months and months, and they had this problem. And he said, however, from what I know of microdosing, where there are always days off and weeks off, I don't see any possible danger. So that's from one of the fearmongers. So that's the best we can do. Is we're limited by no evidence, and we're limited by no evidence in the research literature, and no evidence in the biochemical literature, and no evidence in the medical literature. Other than that, it's maybe.
And so another area where we actually have no evidence of taking a microdose and people having terrible results is people who have schizophrenia in their family history. There's this big thing that if you have any, schizophrenia, you better not even think about it. And since those people are always excluded from all the psychedelic studies,
we don't know.
Now with bipolar, what we do know is that from Jim looking on Reddit is that if you are bipolar, you don't want to take it in the up, it used to be called manic depressive. You don't want to take it in the up manic part of the cycle. But people take it in the depressive part and they're having really good results.
So there is a genuine problem. There's a genuine thing that can go wrong and people report it. And thank goodness you asked, because you didn't know about it. It's called tinnitus. Tinnitus is the ringing in the ears. People have reported that when they microdose, they would have tinnitus. Not too many and not too often, but enough to notice. And people with tinnitus would report that it was worse while microdosing. We don't have reports of it lasting when they stop microdosing. And we do have a couple of reports that it helped people's tinnitus as well. So it's worth noticing that tinnitus actually is a rare but known side effect where we have actual evidence.
And same thing with tracers with people with red-green color blindness. Sometimes they have more tracers and it gets a little bit worse. And some of those people know that and they've continued to microdose anyway.
They say the benefits outweigh having tracers. What they're saying is we microdose on day one and we have tracers for a couple of days. Tracers are when you see an electric light and as you turn, there's kind of the light follows you. It's what you see with a sparkler in the dark, that kind of track of light.
And from what I understand,
that's the best we can do.
Yeah, you do have some reports of people who experience some anxiety sometimes. And what I read in the book, that's like, oh yeah, no, cut your dose in half and a half again. Most people, that anxiety doesn't continue.
With anxiety, we have a nuance between, is it free-floating generalized anxiety that maybe microdosing won't work, but if it's anxiety hooked to depression or hooked to public speaking or hooked to a specific issue in your life, then it generally seems to be fine and doesn't make it worse.
Right. And the last one would be drug-to-drug interactions, which don't go into in full detail because you have a huge list in your book of things that are known to be safe. But from what I understand, for the most part,
reported
it's mostly
to be
safe.
Like everything else in the book, they're reported to be safe by people who use them. And there are two kinds of meds. People want to stay on them. Will microdosing make it harder? And the answer is no. Can they get off them? Microdosing will help. But again, when we say talk to your physician, that's a kind of nonsense because that assumes that there are serious studies looking at drug interactions. And pharmaceutical companies don't like to do that research. So there's very little of it out there. What we do have, again, is people reporting that at least for that person or those people, this particular medication, supplement, herb, etc., didn't prevent them having a successful microdosing experience. That's all we can say. We don't know.
Okay. I apologize that it got to the point that we were rushing there at the end and that I've taken a bit more of your time than planned. You have so much incredible things to say about this huge topic, and we've barely scratched the surface. Your book, Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance, goes much more deeply into all of these things and beyond. How can people get a copy of this book? How would you suggest them to look into more information about this or your other areas of work?
If you go
to the website, microdosingbook.com, and you hit the order button, it will take you to a page that, based on where you are in the world, will give you a set of options of where you can buy it from, so you don't have to only buy it from Amazon. One thing that we found out is that the audiobook is doing very well, maybe outperforming the hardcover. That's in part because we have a great narrator. Kaleo Griffith is his name. And because of the question and answer format of the book, the audio format works really well with that. You can sort of hear one answer at a time and either go on or stop. It's all, everything is within it. So, that's what's available at this point.
And I don't know if there's a tariff.
If there's a tariff. I don't know if there's which tariff on what and what day of the week is it now. So,
exactly.
But let's not go there.
We prefer that people go to their local independent bookstore and have the bookstore order it so that the community wins.
Right.
Awesome.
But we don't stop you from doing it on your computer right now while it's on your mind.
Great. Well, what I'm going to do is I'll get more details about your social medias and anything else that you might want to promote there. And I'll add it into the outro to this episode, which people will hear me say in a minute that I record afterwards. And Jordan, Jim, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for your excellent book and for the work that you've been helping to put together here in the world. It's very helpful.
And thank you for your thoughtful interview.
Thank you for not only your thoughtful interview, but bringing in your own people before, so we have some questions that we wouldn't have gotten without their help. Thank you.
Okay. And cut. Okay. That is the end of that interview here for episode 197. The book Jim and Jordan recently wrote is called Microdosing for Health, Healing, and Enhanced Performance. It's a wonderful book. Apparently it is also an audiobook if that interests you. And I would highly recommend checking it out. Oh my goodness. Checking it out if you have any interest, excitement, or curiosity about microdosing, either practically or as a premise, be it for yourself or for your loved ones. Big recommendations for this book. Great work. Well done, gentlemen. Thank you very much. You can head to microdosingbook.com for all the different ways you can purchase it. The sort of venue of marketplace and format is available there. It's also a place where on that website you can ask questions, make comments, or report anonymously your experiences with microdosing psychedelics. There's also a list of all the other shows that they have done speaking about microdosing. Fingers crossed, this show will be on there as well. So definitely head to microdosingbook.com. If you would like to follow what Jim and Jordan are doing, they did recently start a YouTube channel under the name Fadiman Gruber. I'll make sure that's on the screen on YouTube, linked in YouTube and in the description to this episode. And that's all. You should definitely check out more of Jim and Jordan's stuff. If you like what I do, you can follow me, Blue Sky, Instagram, Telegram, Reddit, Substack, boom, lots of stuff. Sorry, it's the end of my workday right now, and I'm really hoping that this recording goes well, and I'm not going to look at it tomorrow morning and go, damn, I got to redo that. Yes. That's all. Follow me, check me out. Links to all of that, social media and such, is in the description wherever you're checking out this episode. This has been 197 of Adventures to the Mind. We're almost at 200. No idea if I'm going to do anything special for it. I had even recently forgot it was the 10-year anniversary of the podcast somehow. If you have suggestions for what I could do for a 200th episode, leave it as a comment wherever you're listening to it, or message me on Blue Sky or otherwise, because I'm open to that. Sounds like a great idea. Whatever it is, might be a terrible idea. I'll still read it. And that's all. I'm rambling. I'm tired. And this is the end of episode 197. I've been your host, James Jesso. Thank you so much. And until the next episode, take care and stay curious.